So Sri Narad Muni had given a good um, explanation of the allegory that he had spoken at length. And now Narad Muni gives a direct description of the material existence. So every conditioned soul goes through a so-called experience of pleasure within the realm of matter. And while they are trying to chase after the phantasmagoria of material pleasure, they are forced to accept the conditions of birth, death, old age, and disease. And at the time of death, every living entity has to leave behind everything except for his or her karma, which is mixed in with his or her contaminated consciousness. And that determines their next birth. And this karma generally gets stored as reactions, desires, or you can say stored imprints, then dissatisfactions, hopes, different kinds of grudges. And in this way, they guarantee a life full of suffering in the next life. And in this way, the endless cycle of birth and death continues. And after all, it is this baggage of karma that pushes him from one body to another. So Narad Muni is very concisely characterizing the nature of this material existence, that approximately for about 100 years, every embodied living entity freely chooses however way the living entity wants to act. And each act, whether it is in the mode of passion, mode of goodness, or mode of ignorance, takes shape into future births. And therefore, Narad Muni gives two beautiful analogies. The first analogy is that of a dog, which is getting whipped by the power of destiny and driven by hunger, and always searching for food that will alleviate their hunger. And the second analogy that Narad Muni gives is the analogy of shifting the load. It's a very, very famous analogy that Prabhupada had quoted in different places. So let's just look at some of the purports. So first purport let's look at is the 26 to 27, where it is described how the living entity by nature has minute independence to choose his own good or bad fortune. But when he forgets his supreme master, the personality of Godhead, he gives himself up unto the modes of material nature. Being influenced by the modes of material nature, he identifies himself with the body, and for the interest of the body becomes attached to various activities. Sometimes he is under the influence of the mode of ignorance, sometimes the mode of passion, and sometimes the mode of goodness. The living entity thus gets different types of bodies under the modes of material nature. So in the purport, Prabhupada quotes the famous verse of the Bhagavad Gita, Purusha Prakritistohi. The living entity in material nature follows the ways of life, enjoying the three modes of nature. This is due to his association with that material nature. Thus he meets with good and evil among various species. Because of associating with the modes of nature, the living entity gets a variety of bodies from the 8.4 million forms. It is clearly explained herein that the living entity has a little independence, indicated by the word swadrik, meaning one who can see his own welfare. The living entity's constitutional position is very minute, and he can be misled in his choice. He may choose to imitate the Supreme Personality of Godhead. A servant may desire to start his own business and imitate his master. And when he chooses to do so, he may leave the protection of his master. Sometimes he is a failure and sometimes he is successful. Similarly, the living entity part and parcel of Krishna starts his own business to compete with the Lord. This is an interesting way of looking at it. There are many competitors out to attain the Lord's position, but to become like the Lord is not at all possible. Thus, there is a great struggle for existence with the material world as different parties try to imitate the Lord. Material bondage is caused by deviation from the service of the Lord and attempts to imitate him. The Lord is imitated by Mayavadi philosophers who try to become one with the Lord in an artificial way. When the Mayavadi philosophers think of themselves as liberated, they are under the delusion of mental concoction. No one can become one with or equal to God. To imagine this is to continue one's bondage in material existence. So in this way, there are different attempts the living entity makes while living in this material world to counteract the misery. And Srila Prabhupada elaborates on that in the verse number 32 purport, where the analogy of dog comes in. That just as a dog wanders here and there for a piece of bread or punishment, the living entity perpetually wanders about trying to be happy and planning in so many ways to counteract material misery. This is called the struggle for existence. We can actually see in our daily lives how we are forced to make plans to drive away miserable conditions. To get rid of one miserable condition, we have to put ourselves in another kind of miserable condition. A poor man suffers for want of money, but if he wants to become rich, he has to struggle in so many ways. Actually, that is not a valid counteracting process, but a snare of the illusory energy. If one does not endeavor to counteract his situation, but is satisfied with his position, knowing that he has obtained his position through past activities, he can instead engage his energy to develop Krishna consciousness. So this is one thing that the poor man has to suffer a lot in want of money, and there's a great struggle to become rich. But once that poor man becomes rich, typically what happens is that that person also becomes puffed up, that I did everything on my own accord, and that becomes a source of another problem. So the improvements that are basically on the material level cause one to exchange or trade off one misery for another. And this is the example that Nārada Muni gives, very, very graphic example, that a man may carry a burden on his head, and when he feels it to be too heavy, he sometimes gives relief to his head by putting the burden on his shoulder. In this way, he tries to relieve himself of the burden. However, whatever process he devises to counteract the burden does nothing more than put the same burden from one place to another. So, purport number 33. When one gets tired of keeping a burden on his head, he will place it on his shoulder. This does not mean that he has become freed from the strains of carrying the burden. Similarly, human society, in the name of civilization, is creating one kind of trouble to avoid another kind of trouble. In contemporary civilization, we see that there are many automobiles manufactured to carry us swiftly from one place to another. But at the same time, we have created other problems. We have to construct so many roads, and yet these roads are insufficient to cope with automobile congestion and traffic jams. There are also the problems of air pollution and fuel shortage. This is called construction destruction paradox. The conclusion is that the processes we manufacture to counteract or minimize our distresses do not actually put an end to our pains. It is all simply illusion. We simply place the burden from the head to the shoulder, The only real way we can minimize our problems is to surrender unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead and give ourselves up to His protection. The Lord, being all-powerful, can make arrangements to mitigate our painful life in material existence. So there's an identification of the problem and also a solution that is reiterated here, which is to take shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and just go on, and not just go on suffering endlessly in this struggle for material existence. The next that is going to come from Nārada Muni's side is now the description of the soul's positive natural activity, which is devotional service. So things are finally converging into the solution space. So thank you very much. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.